Inflation. It's one of those words you kind of hear everywhere, especially in the news, usually accompanied by a bunch of complicated economic terms. But what is inflation really? And more importantly, why should you care about it? Inflation doesn't just affect Wall Street traders or national budgets, it has a surprisingly direct impact on your day to day life, whether you're grocery shopping, paying for Netflix subscriptions, or planning a vacation. Today, we're going to unpack inflation in a way that's simple, relatable, and eye opening. So, by the end of this, you'll know exactly why this big economic term has a lot to do with your everyday decisions. So, what is inflation? At its core, inflation means that prices are going up. But it's not just a one off thing like the price of gas jumping overnight. Inflation is a sustained rise in the general level of prices across the economy. Imagine that over time, the price of almost everything you buy, food, clothes, streaming subscriptions, even the cost of a haircut, starts to slowly increase. Now, when inflation is high, your money doesn't stretch as far. With each dollar buying you a little less than before, you're left with less bang for your buck. But why does this happen? Inflation is driven by various factors, but two big ones are demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. Now, demand pull inflation happens when more people want something than there is available, pushing prices up. Cost push inflation, on the other hand, occurs when it gets more expensive to make stuff and businesses pass those costs on to us, the consumers. Inflation isn't always bad. A bit of it, around 2 to 3% annually, is actually a sign of a healthy economy. It shows that people are buying, businesses are thriving, and wages are likely rising. But when inflation gets too high, it can spiral out of control, making it harder to buy what you need, and that's when things get a little tricky. So let's start with an example that everyone can relate to, food prices. You've probably noticed that a lot of your usual groceries have gotten pricier recently, from basics like milk and bread to treats like ice cream. This is one of the most immediate ways inflation hits home. But why does food get more expensive? Well, there are a few reasons. First, as inflation rises, it impacts transportation costs. Gas prices often increase, and those higher transportation costs are added to the price of your food. Then there are costs tied to things like labor and packaging materials, which are affected by inflation too. Farmers and food manufacturers have to spend more on equipment, wages, and fertilizers. These rising costs tend to trickle down through the supply chain and eventually hit our wallets at the grocery stores. But there is another, sneakier way inflation changes what's in our shopping cart. Instead of raising prices, some companies reduce the quantity of a product while charging the same price, a practice known as shrinkflation. Have you ever noticed that a bag of chips seems to be a bit emptier, or a family-sized cereal box isn't quite as full as it used to be? Well, companies use shrinkflation to keep prices stable on the surface, but what you're getting is less product for the same amount of money. Now, if you're renting or looking to buy a home, inflation has a huge impact on where you live and how much it costs to stay there. When inflation rises, so does the cost of construction materials like wood, metal, and concrete, making it more expensive to build new homes. This reduces the number of new homes available, which creates more competition for existing homes. Basic economics kicks in here. When demand goes up and supplies goes down, prices increase. For renters, inflation often means higher rent prices because landlords raise rates to cover their own rising costs and to match the higher value of real estate. And for homeowners, well, mortgage rates tend to go up with inflation too. When inflation is high, central banks like the Federal Reserve often increase interest rates to try and cool things down. This makes borrowing more expensive, so people pay more interest on their mortgages. All in all, inflation can make housing, which is a basic human necessity, more difficult to afford. Moving right along to gas prices, well, gasoline is another area where inflation hits pretty hard and fast. You may have noticed that gas prices fluctuate quite a lot, and inflation plays a role in this volatility. Gas prices are closely tied to the price of oil, a global commodity affected by inflation, geopolitics, and supply-demand dynamics. When inflation affects gas prices, it doesn't just make filling up your tank more expensive, it also drives up the cost of transporting goods from clothes to electronics. So, in a way, higher gas prices add an extra layer of inflation to all kinds of goods and services, since companies have to pay more to transport products across the country, and they pass those costs on to us. Now, inflation doesn't just impact what you buy today, it also affects how much money you have in the future. Let's talk about savings a little bit first. So if you're putting money away in a savings account that has a interest rate lower than the rate of inflation, the actual value of your savings is shrinking over time. For example, if inflation is 5% and your savings account only gives you 1% interest, you're technically losing purchasing power on that money, which is why a lot of people choose to invest in the stock market. So with inflation seemingly here to stay, how can you cope with it? Well, first, consider cutting non-essential expenses. Another option is to think about investments that historically keep pace with inflation. Stocks, real estate, and certain types of bonds can grow in value alongside inflation, protecting your purchasing power over time. So in conclusion, inflation isn't just an abstract concept floating around in economic news. It's actually a powerful force that subtly shapes our lives, from what we buy to how we feel. When inflation rises, we feel it at the grocery store, in our rent, at the gas pump, and even in our entertainment choices. But by understanding its impact and learning how to adapt to it, we can make inflation work for us rather than against us. So the next time you hear the word inflation, remember, it's more than just a buzzword. It's a very complex, everyday phenomenon that's constantly changing the way we live, and understanding it is the first step to mastering it.